committee meetings. You should have a copy of it. Is there any discussion or objections to the meetings minutes? Not seeing anything on it, so we'll just consider those approved at this point. And now we're going to move on to, well, actually, before I do that, this is kind of unique. We don't have as many in here as we normally do, but we got to embarrass somebody, right? So there are two Delperdangs present here. So can I get one of them to stand up in the back? So this is my wife, Connie. She came up to see what we did. So anyway, welcome to the committee. Today we're going to have a presentation on electricity and transmission. We've got David, please help me, is it Dismukes? All right, Professor Emeritus at the Center for Energy Solutions in Louisiana State University. Welcome to Kansas, sir. Great to have you here. Yeah. Is the microphone on, or maybe?
How about that? Can anybody hear me? Right. So what I'd like to do today is talk about some energy transition issues. This is based off of some work that I recently talked about at the Energy Council meeting. I believe Kansas is a big member of the Energy Council, which is the consortium of energy producing states in the U.S. And some work that I've done on behalf of large users. In addition to being on the faculty at LSU, I retired recently. I've spent 30 years there and used to run our Center for Energy Studies. I now have kind of stepped down and take a more mentoring role, and I'm a consultant. I've spent a good part of my career working and advising state governments, consumer councils, attorney generals, commission staffs on these issues. So my perspective is a little bit different. I had been working for the last couple of years for the oil and gas business, both throughout the Gulf South and the Mid-Continent region, and recently in Oklahoma. So some of this work has to do with some of the interest of the industry in promoting more natural gas use and these opportunities for energy demand. So a part of the feel for this will be from the consumer side as well as from the producer side from an oil and gas perspective. What I want to do is start off with some takeaways, some things that I'm going to talk to you about and then talk to you about them a little bit. As we looked at what we've done over the last 2 decades, I think it's important to reflect on where we've been over the last 2 decades, to think about why we're going through a transition right now and why we have certain challenges that are facing us. And I think one of the big things that we have to all acknowledge is we've spent a lot of time over the last 2 decades investing significantly in renewable energy resources for a variety of different reasons. And it's not just the construction and development of those renewable energy resources, but a lot of supporting transmission-related and other infrastructure-related investments that have gone with that have amounted to equally large billions of dollars of capital investment. In addition to that, a lot of de-risking opportunities that have occurred for many developers in that renewable energy space, and the fact that if you look at where our grid operators have been, the regional transmission operators for either the Mid-Continent region, the Gulf South, New England, Mid-Atlantic, regardless of where you've been, the emphasis when we started creating these things in the 1990s and early 2000s was mostly opening up the market, restructuring, facilitating wholesale competition, integrating regions, creating resource efficiencies. Over the last 2 decades or so, particularly the last decade and a half, it's been more on facilitating this renewable energy development, a lot of wind, solar, depending on what part of the country you're in, and dedicating large billions of dollars worth of capacity investments into facilitating moving those investments. That's been all fine, and I think that has been an important set of initiatives in order to meet a lot of climate change goals that many regions and states had during that time period. But one of the things that has happened over a couple of years, much like it did in the 1990s where it snuck up on us in the middle of restructuring, was a lot of the capacity that we need in many of our power markets has started to be diminished. We've retired a lot of solid fuel resources. Many of you are familiar with a lot of coal plants that have retired over the last decade or so. We've seen nuclear power plants retire over the last decade or so that served as the workhorses for our baseload generation. And that hasn't been a problem for the last 2 decades because we've focused on energy efficiency, fuel substitution. Growth has been relatively low in the power industry. It used to be in decades past, we were seeing 3–4% growth a year. Over the last couple of years, last decade, you would be lucky as a utility to have 1% growth, right? So it was a relatively flat period, and so there weren't a lot of errors associated with not having that capacity. Those times are changing, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with that from having read the news and heard about all these big data centers and these big changes that are going on with electricity markets. And so what I'm here today is kind of talk about where we've been, kind of why this is important now and why there's been a big changing in paradigm and a change in thinking and probably a change in action and investment as we move forward. So let's talk a little bit about the reliance on these intermittent resources and why this is going to be a challenge as we move forward. As we look at things like data centers and other large users that require high degrees of and abundant amounts of highly reliable electricity. And you can see this chart here. It's a little bit busy. I'm going to try to use my pointer here on the right. And I don't think it's showing up too well, but you can see the kind of darker line and the bluer lines picking up, which are your renewable generation increases for the U.S., as well as some natural gas increases. Coal has certainly been falling, but you can see there are really big increases in renewable energy during that time period. And the same is true for Kansas. So the chart that I've got here, and again, I'm going to make these available for you all. Oh, you've already got them, in fact. So, and if anybody in the audience wants them later, I'll certainly do that as well. But you can see that this reliance on renewable energy has picked up. Most of the generating capacity that we've added, regardless of what state you're in most places of the U.S., has been focused almost exclusively on this renewable generation. If you look at what we call the interconnection queue, or the list of projects that are applying for interconnecting into the big high voltage grid, you can see a distribution of the capacity in megawatts and the percentage here on the right-hand side of the table of what types of resources are requesting to be built and developed and added into the SPP in this particular instance. But you could look at any other one. You could look at MISO. You could look at PJM. You could look at various other RTOs, and you'd find similar types of outcomes. And you can see here that over 88% of all the generation right now looking for interconnection into the SPP is an intermittent resource. Okay, that's been fine over the last several years. It has been costly. There have been some people who have argued and debated about this, but our demand requirements were not such that we needed a lot of highly reliable power and generation capacity at that time. If we're looking at changing that on a forward-going basis, having 88% of your capacity additions right now that are on intermittent resources can be a challenge. You'll see the thermal resources there, the natural gas as being the only one there at about 11%, right? Those are the ones that have very high capacity and availability factors, we refer to as effective load carrying capabilities, that they can meet that demand when your systems peak and in winter, in high winter demand usage periods, as well as summer peak days. That's about 11%. If you look in Kansas only, you can see that that number is down to about 6%, and the renewable shares are much higher, with about 1,500 megawatts in thermal generation, primarily tied up with natural gas. So this is the outlook. This is where we've been, and this is today, as we stand here, what the resources are in that interconnection queue to start meeting the new load requirements that we have on a forward-going basis. As I mentioned before, there is this terminology on the effective load carrying capabilities, and that is how good is a resource at meeting and supplying load, at supplying generation at peak demand times, when you've got hot summer afternoons and everybody's turning on their air conditioning, or in winter time periods in the early morning hours when people are turning on heat and electric heat and resistance heat, and they need that electricity. And you can see these numbers here are relatively low. For wind in the summer is down around 13 to 18%, and this is as it's been rated by the SPP for rating purposes. That means that effective ability to meet those requirements are relatively low. If you look at something like natural gas, those numbers are going to be relatively higher. And so again, a bit of a challenge as we move forward on these new load requirements, not just on the data centers alone, as I'll tell you later, but in industrial applications and commercial applications and other sorts of applications that are going to be equally hungry for electricity as we move forward, given the nature and the change of our energy requirements on the electric side. What has this meant for capital investment? We've seen tremendous amounts of money poured into the power business over the last 2 decades. This is just for your largest multi-utility and electric utilities, as it's been represented by Standard & Poor's. Thank you. And you can see that growth rate has been somewhere around 6%. It's growing around 8 to 9% on total now. Most of the amount of this is growing in the lines portion of the business. So you see the light purple region, and you can see that dramatic increase that we're talking about before. And these are in billions, on annuals of billions of dollars. So today, in the past, we were looking at $10, $15 billion today. On a forward-going basis, out into 2028, we're looking at somewhere around $30 billion. So almost double the amount that we've historically seen over that time period. And if you look throughout the projected needs for transmission throughout the United States, you could see anywhere, and you can see that as these renewable percentages increase in share, as you move from 60, 70, 80%, the billions of dollars add up, and you're starting to move up to areas where you're in thousands of billions or trillions of dollars. DOE has the various different studies that they have done relative to those cuts of renewable energy, and you can see those numbers average somewhere around 500 billion or a half trillion in additional incremental transmission investment that we'll need to meet those renewable energy requirements on a forward-going basis. In the SPP, we've seen relatively lower investments relative to some of the other RTOs, but you can see in the most recent budget, it's over 18 times that 10-year average. So this is a region that's also going to start seeing considerable and additional investments as well. I've got some charts here that you can look at again later. I've put the ones from MISO up there. I know it's probably not as relevant for you all in Kansas, but similar trends in those areas in other parts of the mid-continent region and moving into the South. In the PJM as well, where you have a lot more robust and differing types of resources and wholesale power markets and a lot of restructuring and competition in those areas. What about the capacity challenges? What are some of the things that we're seeing on a forward-going basis? As we move forward, we're going to continue to see renewable energy. This isn't a discussion today to throw shade on renewable energy or to say that renewable energy is going away, but I think if there is a point that I want to make today is if we are serious about an all of the above strategy, now's the time to start getting serious about that because of the new power requirements that we're going to have on the system that while they are looking for environmentally sensitive offsets, are also going to need reliability requirements to go along with that. This is the SPP projections on their minimum reserve requirements that they've had historically, which is around 13%. They've now increased to about 15%. You can look at the more recent forecasts that see essentially their projections as we move into 2028 falling below those minimum requirements. So there is a need for new power generation, and there's going to be a need to meet these new high loads that we're seeing in data centers that run all the time. These are facilities run 8,760 hours out of the year. They're not down, they're not cycling, they're not up and down. We can do a lot of energy efficiency activities at these facilities, but they're still power hungry types of things. They're electronic computer equipment that runs with electricity. If we look at where we've been over the last couple of years, we've seen some threats, obviously on reliability. The number of emergency alert trends that have happened throughout the eastern and western interconnects have been relatively robust. They've picked up recently in the eastern interconnect. So the times that we have to notify load serving entities for interruptions and to shedding load have increased, and that's also been a problem. So it's, we're starting to, you can see that we're getting to an inflection point between the disconnect in the demand and the supply, and it's starting to show up in many of the activities that we've got here on a forward-going basis. Has this really been worth the squeeze? Well, one of the things you have to think about is where his price has gone. For somebody who spends most of his time advising energy users and working on the ratepayer side, and for state government agencies, bills are important and rates are important for not only residential customers and households, but they're important for economic development. When you're looking to site industrial loads in particular locations, one of the first things they're going to look at, in addition to tax issues, are going to be how much is the electricity or the energy that I'm going to pay in one of these areas. And you can see this dramatic increase corresponding with what we've seen over the last couple of years with many of these dislocations and huge investments in infrastructure to support those renewable energy investments. If you look at affordability, which is another statistic that is becoming increasingly more important for a lot of policymakers around the United States, that essentially looks at your energy expenditures divided by your income. What is your energy expenditures as a share of your income? Is it becoming a bigger portion of your check every month, or is it a lower portion? And you can see those numbers increasing. This is for median income. And when I first started looking at these statistics, that dark line that you can see over here on either side is kind of what you would calculate just based on the numbers as they're reported. And it was a little shocking to me, knowing all these costs that have been going on and all the rate cases that have been going on around the United States, that energy affordability was actually becoming better, not worse, given those changes. Until I started digging into a lot of those numbers. And like I said before, it's a quotient. You've got the numerator, which is your expenditures, right? You got the denominator, which is your income. Well, in addition to your income, which are your wages and your compensation, federal transfers and federal entitlement programs will go into that denominator too, because they're transfers that increase your wealth and help you out. So there's been, one of the things I noticed is that denominator is getting big and has been over the last couple of years because of a lot of federal transfers, particularly on the Medicaid side. And if you were to back those out and just look at what your raw income is without those federal transfers, you can see now that trend of the affordability getting worse and worse, meaning that a lot of money that's been diverted to help people out on other things like healthcare costs and living expenses, et cetera, are getting diverted into energy costs, and those numbers actually get hidden until you start pulling those out and looking at them. Again, this is at the median household level. This is just normal, the average, more or less. If you look at this for the lower 20% income category, you see those numbers get much more problematic, and they're in many instances above the income burden level that we usually set, which is somewhere around 6 to 10%. So those are very problematic in terms of spending. So as we move forward, we got lots of big challenges, but we've already created big challenges for ourselves as well in terms of affordability. And the same is true when you start thinking about rate competitive for commercial and industrial customers. I haven't gone through that today, but you see similar types of trends. More and more of your operating budget going to electricity and other types of energy costs. You look at the power generation reductions. What have we gotten as a consequence of that? Most of our reductions in greenhouse gas emissions over the last 2 decades have admittedly come from a lot of new renewable energy generation, and they've made big contributions to that. But so has fuel substitution into natural gas. And so what this chart is looking at is on the dark purple, you're seeing the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from natural gas generation, and in the light purple, you're seeing what renewable has brought to that. If you were to take and stack those two together, that would be your total reduction. But you can see where the larger share is on this, and it's been from fuel substitution into those natural gas resources and not from a renewables perspective, plus the fact that in many instances, some of those substitutions have been capacity improving, not capacity reducing. So are we in a new area, given all those supply constraints? What happens if we are starting to enter into, and are we entering into, a new change in the environment on rapid electricity use? And what I would do is this is a more of a generalized chart that if I had to characterize where the history of the industry has been in terms of growth, you can see from 1980 to the 1990s, we saw rapid increases in electricity growth and use per customer going on. And this is when America and households and businesses were all moving to the digital age and the dot-com industry started. Think about your own homes. Most homes didn't have personal computers. Then in the 90s, they started having 2 and 3. You remember those old TVs, the big screen TVs that put off so much heat, you had to turn the air conditioners on. Today, they're much more efficient than they were in the old days, but we were using a lot of electricity back then, a lot of growth. Throughout most of the 2000s, particularly starting about 2005 on, that's where we went through that more recent energy crisis. That's when we had all the storms in the Gulf of Mexico. We had a lot of natural gas. That's when natural gas prices were really high. We thought we were going to import a lot of our resources. This was before the shale revolution. This started somewhere around 2008, 2009. So we had a lot of destruction and demand occur during that time period. A lot of big initiatives for utilities around the United States to promote energy efficiency programs, to make households more efficient. A lot of incentives during this time period for the federal government to go in on appliance standards and to reduce energy usage on things like refrigerators and TVs and other things that we use in everyday life. So we've had relatively flat growth, as I alluded to in my earlier comments, somewhere around less than 1%, 1.5%, 0.8%, 1% for most utilities. But as we move on the foregoing basis, I would argue that the paradigm's about to shift again, and we're going to see a period that in many ways is similar to what we saw in the 1990s, and in fact could be even more poignant and more dramatic than what we saw during that time period for a lot of reasons that I'll show you. This is a forecast on just the last 3 years on peak power demand requirements that was done by Grid Strategies, which is a consulting business in the industry. And you can see how their forecast from 2022 increased by 19 gigawatts. Gigawatts is 1,000 megawatts, so that's 19,000 megawatts. Think about a nuclear power plant being 1 gigawatt. So that's 19 nuclear power plants worth of load that has increased to 2023. And their recent forecast that came out this year to 88 gigawatts. So that's the basis of part of the argument and the point that I'm trying to make on some of these changes and why we are going through what I would call a pretty dramatic paradigm shift in how the industry is using, not just the industry, but how all of us are changing and using our electricity. And where is this coming from? I know a lot of attention, and I'm going to put increasing more attention as I go through this today on these data centers because I know they're important to a lot of people. But that's not the only thing that's going on in the world that's using electricity. And I think it's important to keep those in mind because these are other end uses that are going to be relying on the grid for new power generation resources, as well as transmission lines and other supporting investment. You've got energy production and manufacturing. So the current administration would like to see an increase of 3 million barrels a day in production in the United States. You need energy to make energy in this business, right? And so 3 million a barrel a day is going to require a lot more electricity to process that crude oil. It's going to need a lot more compression costs. I'm going to need lift costs. A lot of my costs in the field level are going to be electricity driven. So if you want me to enhance drilling and production activities, there's going to be electricity associated with that, as well as in the downstream parts of the business. We're big net exporters now of energy, both crude oil and petroleum related, as well as in these big natural gas facilities they're building down in my part of the world. Those all use a lot of electricity to chill that gas down, right? And to make it cold. There's a lot of energy applications. Most of those applications have their own power plants co-located at those particular facilities. So there's big energy uses right there alone, much less the data centers, right? We've got industrial electrification that's going on in a lot of facilities and has been going on since the 1990s. It used to be very common to run compression and motors and other pumps on fuels that you had, whether they were waste fuels or liquid fuels on those sites. You would have a natural gas compressor. Nowadays, you use electricity on those sites so you can reduce your on-site emissions. So we're seeing a lot of that continue. Everybody's familiar with changes that are going on relative to transportation and automobiles, the Teslas of the world, all the other electric cars that are plugging into the grid. Building electrification that is going on. A lot of buildings are switching out from chillers that use natural gas and other types of combustion-related appliances in HVAC systems to things that are electricity-oriented. And obviously, the thing that's gotten most of the attention over the last 12 months to 24 months that's really stirring and churning up the trade media has been these data centers. Like I mentioned before, industry has been doing this for quite some time. If you go back and you look at some of the challenges that we had during Winter Storm Uri, one of those problems was getting electricity to many of these facilities out. And you had this kind of compounding problem where I couldn't get natural gas to market because I didn't have any electricity to run the pumps and the motors because I'd swapped them all out for electricity instead of using natural gas at the field level anymore. So there's a lot of interdependency even in oil and gas production today for electricity, and even in these heavy industrial applications, whether you're at gas processing facilities, whether you're at an LNG facility, whether you're at a fractionation facility or refinery, it doesn't matter in the energy business, you're using a lot of electricity too. About half of your use at a modern petrochemical facility or a refinery is going to be electricity related of your variable cost. Who have been those states that we've seen those big electricity sales growth been? It's been the energy producing states. Many of the Energy Council members that are in here, you'll see North Dakota, Texas, New Mexico, Louisiana, Oklahoma, all of those states, because energy over the last year or so, 2-3 years or so, has been a big user of those changes and the big industrial plan announcements we've seen for actually probably more like the last decade. But now we're looking at big changes that are coming from data centers, and a lot of the attention with the data centers has been with this AI use. But keep in mind that the data centers use electricity for a lot of different things, and they're all not homogeneous. They may focus on one thing or another, and so their energy requirements and their ability to scale how they use that energy may be different. They're all very big energy users, and I think that's an important takeaway. But you've got cloud computing. I'm sure most of y'all are familiar in the legislature. If you work with state government, it wasn't too long ago, everybody had their own server. Maybe the Senate had theirs, the House had theirs, different committees had their own servers. Now we do everything in the cloud. At the university, I had to swap all our systems. We had 15 different servers across different units. Now we do everything in the cloud. My own business, small businesses today, all use cloud computing. You got to have a place to put that. That's what those data centers do in large part too. That's a big requirement, right? Think about our world today. Most people do use that cloud computing. Content delivery networks. You're out there, you're watching something from Prime Video, you want to watch a movie while you're waiting in the airport, where do you think that's coming from? Those are getting hosted and distributed around places of the country so they can get that video and that content to you. Enterprise data storage and processing, big volume storage that you'll have with big industrial or big large retailers are important. Telecommunications, does anybody know what a desk phone is anymore? I mean, after COVID, we all use Teams, we use Zoom, and we use our cell phones, right? We don't use these old land-based systems, so a lot of that's moving over the internet too. We still have, in the old days when we talked about data centers and computational capabilities, what did we used to talk about? It was mostly at research units, right? It used to be at universities. Who has a supercomputer? Well, these are all big, tied up, run in serial order supercomputers, more or less. And then AI and crypto is there. Those numbers are probably 10 to 20% on average, and I mean on big average. Some systems may dedicate all their stuff to AI, some may not, but you're looking at those big averages. They may not seem like a lot, and I think that is something to kind of keep into account as we're looking at that composition. But when you think about where the growth is probably going to be coming from the next 10 years, it's probably going to be in those. You think about cloud computing, that growth is probably petering out. It's still significant. A lot of people have moved to the cloud, but think about AI and crypto. We're just taking off on those kinds of areas as well. So the need for this demand is out there and will continue to be out there. We've got a lot of different developers that are in this space. We've got the obvious users, Amazon Web Services, Google, Microsoft, Meta, that are out there developing facilities. We've got independent third parties that are out there leasing them out. A lot of people want, in my opinion, when I've been working on these issues around the country, have tried to analyze it or try to draw analogies of these current changes with the data centers to what happened in the 90s with the dot-com era. Now, if you remember back in the dot-com era, we were getting ISPs, internet service providers, popping up all over the place. Big difference in scale here, people, between the ISPs and some of these data centers. These ISPs would pop up in strip malls, in other places, in commercial locations. They were just small servers accessing AOL. You know, you've got mail, let's go get that. These are much different scales that we're talking about. In some instances, for the hyperscalers, you're looking at a per facility investment of $1 billion. This is not just getting a space next to a Foot Locker. This is big amounts of investments here. So I think to draw the analogy that these people will make these investments lightly, will get out of town and run, is a little bit stretched. In order to make these kind of financial commitments, to get to a financial investment decision or an FID for most of these companies who do have shareholders and are traded, there has to be a certain degree of certainty embedded around this that's expected in most businesses and industries today. So I think there's a lot of overplaying on these guys, building a lot of investment in these guys leaving town. It's something to be mindful of, and cost shifting considerations are very important. And somebody who represents users, I do want to make sure that you understand that. But I don't think these arguments of these guys jumping in and out of town every day is probably a very valid one. So do keep that in mind. There's a lot of industries that are using AI and all these computational resources, whether it be in healthcare, retail, and e-commerce, reselling it through their own cloud services or technology. So the feeds, the back feeds into the rest of our economy are increasing every day. So these people are providing very important inputs to our economic growth and technological innovation in a wide range of other sectors. So even if you don't have any of those activities in your state in terms of the data center, you may be big in healthcare, and healthcare will rely on those. So the health of that industry is going to be important for you if you're trying to outgrow that health industry that I think is just starting to tap, you know, what the big opportunities are in AI for solving problems like cancer and Alzheimer's and other things. You can see this map. This was done by Boston Consulting Group, looking at where the various regions are in the United States, where these loads are anticipated increase for the data centers. Again, you can see thousands of megawatts. Everybody's got a little bit different forecast out there. I think the takeaway in all of this is that there's just an awful lot of potential energy use that will come from this. Most of your growth lately has been in the commercial side of the business, in terms of commercial electricity growth, and you can see those states, and those states tend to be the ones that have the highest data centers. Most of the data center concentration today, you're wondering, what is Virginia there? A lot of it's in Northern Virginia, Maryland, around the DC complex, around the government complex that have been meeting these data center requirements for the Department of Defense, government, other types of places. If you look at EPRI, EPRI is the Electric Power Research Institute. It is the leading independent research organization for the electric power industry. You can see their projections that could be anywhere from 3.5%, a little over 3.5% a year in growth, to as much as to 15% of annual growth, or comprising almost 9 to 10% of total sales today from almost nothing. So that would be a really rapid growth in just a matter of a decade or less. These can be big job creators. I would kind of caution you, though, these are mostly jobs that are created on the development side when you're building them. Once you've done them, they're not big employment gainers. But if you think about it from a local property tax perspective, you're going to get lots of tax revenues with not lots of pressures on your social services. You're not building roads to meet a Toyota plan or a Nissan plan or something like that. So these can be, you know, what we call lagniappe back home. It's a lot of gravy, a lot of excess there that for a lot of local communities that are looking at these $500 million, billion-dollar investments. Lately, we've had some big investment announcements that I think have shaken the industry. Not that we can't get enough turmoil and risk that's out there in our market today. Right after the new administration changed over, I think 2 or 3 days, OpenAI and Oracle and SoftBank made this big announcement that I think many of you are familiar with for the Stargate project. They want to invest as much as $500 billion in AI infrastructure and data centers to facilitate this new change that we're seeing in computational resources and in demand. So if you figure that's anywhere from $100 billion to $500 billion. Some people have said, you can't do it. There have been some criticisms and some skepticism about that investment. Let's say they only do half of that, $250 billion. Every billion is one hyperscaled facility, roughly. Every billion is about a gigawatt of requirement. So 500 billion is 500 gigawatts of new power plants, if that comes to pass. Now, projects on paper are just that, so keep that in mind. But if it's just half of that amount, That's a lot. If it's a quarter of that amount, it's still a lot, right? And so this was a big wake-up call, I think. And again, to put that into perspective, if you go back to the Enron days, the last time we had a major build-out of natural gas power generation from 1999 to around 2000, when I was very young, started working in this business. That's we had 500 gigawatts of announcements during that time period. About 250 of that got developed, and that was considered the largest build-out in recent history on that, at least on the natural gas side, and at least in a 4-year period too. You know, certainly we built lots of nuclear plants over a long period of time and coal plants, but those were over decades. Those weren't over 4 years. So you're looking at investments potentially that could outpace even what we did in the late 90s and early 2000s. Then a couple of weeks later, we got an announcement that there's this new game in town, DeepSeek, which is funded by Chinese investors that have come up with a better mousetrap. They have a better, more computational efficient way of going about doing their AI algorithms and computing and solving for AI searches. And so maybe that demand isn't going to be so great, right? Just to put it in perspective, I don't know, I've seen the numbers vary, but an AI search will take anywhere from 6 to 10 times the amount of electricity that a simple Google search will take. So you're thinking about how much more electricity you are. And if you're cutting that in half, you're still 3 to 6 times, right? But it's still a lot of energy and a lot of electricity. So that scared the market. A lot of oil and gas stocks went down the day after that. A lot of merchant power stocks went flying through the floor after that. I kind of chuckled because it's like, look, this isn't going away. Even if we do half or a quarter, we're still looking at an amazing big build out. A couple of things to keep in mind about this. I think it goes without saying that in any industry and technology, innovation is going to occur, efficiency is going to occur, because that's how you gain at the margin, right? So we need to expect that's going to happen at some point. But a couple of things to keep in mind. We're already short now, as I established in those charts already. So we need power plants today. So we've got to serve that load out there, and it's not going to change based on this new announcement. AI is going to make up anywhere today and in the next couple of years, 10 to 20 to 30, let's say even 40% of the activity at the data center. So there's still another anywhere from 30 to 60, 70 to 60, 70% that's out there that won't be impacted by this. And again, even if this development potential is a fraction, it's still going to be a large amount and something to think about from a policy perspective. I won't go too much into this, but a lot of utilities are now starting to see these changes rapidly, and they're going before their regulators. They're going before some legislators asking for changes or directing their commissions to make certain changes in how they respond to these loads. We're seeing lots of, I'm working around the country with lots of filings where various utilities are making proposals to offer unique tariffs and service offerings for these data centers to actually accommodate them. These all are meritorious. I think there's a lot of good reasons for doing this. I think that you need to be careful, though, in how you do this. You don't want to unnecessarily segment the market. You don't want to treat people. I think the big concern that I would have from the economic development perspective is not treating people comparably in new loads and old loads. So you think about a new load of 500 megawatts, that's a data center. And you're giving them special preferences, but you're not giving special preferences to a 500 megawatt new load at a refinery or at a new manufacturing plant or something like that. Those are things to keep. Same thing though with the data centers. You're going in, and because you have concerns that these guys are going to skip town, I want to put a 10-year contract requirement on you, whereas for the refinery, I only put a 1 or 2 year on them. So I think comparability that's the big challenge that I see as someone who not only works on the rate setting side of this, but works a lot in economic development, that I see we need to be really walk very tenderly on and be very careful about as well. So in terms of conclusions on this, I hope that you take away from this that, you know, more reliable, quickly developed natural gas fire generation is going to be important. It's time to kind of move that pendulum back in terms of a balanced energy policy. We're going to need a lot of flexibility, not only from the policy side, but from utilities as well. So they're going to need to come to the game. There have been some that have been big leaders on this, and there are some that have been a little obstinate in some of the parts of the country that I've worked in. And so that has to change. There are significant economic development opportunities, and they also leverage, I think, your opportunities for economic development, not only in other sectors, but meeting the capacity requirements for, you know, normal loads in the residential and the commercial sector. If I'm out there and building new power plants, and I've got a load that I'm meeting to meet a data center, it doesn't take me a lot to add a little bit extra at the time of capacity at the time I'm building this to serve my native load requirements for my load serving entity responsibilities. And so that's good for in avoiding some of those problems like those emergency alerts that I talked about before, some of those concerns about reserve margins falling below planning levels, those kinds of things. And I think, watching kind of the regulatory gimmicks of the day, I think we've got a good process in place. When there's no need to throw the baby out with the bathwater or get panicky about all of this. But I think it is a good time to start thinking seriously about adding power plants in capacity. I know that hasn't been a politically popular thing to do over the last 10 years or so, but if we're really going to take advantage of this and be global leaders here in the United States on that, not just in the mid-continent in Kansas, but, as a nation overall, it's something we need to think about. This is my contact information for those of y'all, if you want to get in touch with me later. Hopefully I didn't go over too much, and hopefully I didn't talk too fast. They say I'm the fastest speaker of anybody born and raised south of I-10, so.
South of I-10. You definitely covered a lot.
When I used to teach, if you dropped a pencil in my class, you lost 2 pages of notes. So.
You covered a lot of information, sir.
But yeah, thank you all again for having me here, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Eddie.
Yeah, I have more just of a comment. We hear a bunch of good presentations and presenters. This was probably one of the best. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really like your conclusions. I'm going to keep this close. I find all of these to be accurate based upon what we've learned here this year in energy. Yeah, and I'll say this: I spend time in the sportsman's paradise of Louisiana. A couple times a year, we go down to south of New Orleans to the bayou near Port Sulphur, where there's a ginormous LNG.
Yeah.
So I'm always super impressed with how pro-energy Louisiana is and forward-thinking you guys are. And so I appreciate the presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Schillingen-Siepen.
I can only echo the words of the previous colleague who spoke, or the colleague who spoke previously. And thank you for your presentation. If you were going to boil this down for my rate-paying constituents, what does the future look like?
Look, I think it's a great opportunity, but we need to exercise a little caution, kind of not lose our bearings in all of this. I think, equity is an important issue to think about in all of this, and I don't mean, in terms of creating large transfer payments, but, making sure that everybody's paying their fair share in all of this. And I think there's a reasonable opportunity. In many of the negotiations that we've been in, that I've worked on behalf of ratepayers, with some of these data centers coming in, they've been pretty willing to want to go in and pay their fair share. I've been in situations where new industries come in and they want a lot of handouts and stuff. This has been refreshingly different, I think, for a lot of them. They have been willing to make certain commitments, but they do all have their lines too that they don't want to cross over. So I don't think there's a lot of fear that I think is getting generated in there. So what I would say is to dampen down on the fear. There are some good arguments out there that we need to be concerned about, and a lot of bad ones that I've heard that are out there as well. So
If I can follow up, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted, you talked about the denominator, and if I'm looking at current federal policy in general terms, looks like that denominator is going to be losing some.
Well, yeah, so it depends on what happens. I mean, if they're finding efficiency gains, but it's not impacting the direct transfer payments, it's just in the admin side, then it won't. If they're really just reducing those transfer payments in total, then yeah, it will.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. Representative Chuck Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here. Do you have many data centers in Louisiana?
We do. We have some announcements. We have a big one in Richland Parish that just got announced as a big hyperscale facility. I think we're going to be building, I've forgotten exactly, somewhere around 2,500 plus megawatts just to support that. And we're looking at adding maybe a doubling amount of that to facilitate some other projects that may be coming in behind it.
We're looking at data center possibility in Kansas, and they say it takes a lot of water, where I would think Louisiana has a lot of water, but Kansas fights water problem. How big of a problem do we have with water if it's not abundant?
Right, so that's not my big area, so I can't speak to it a whole lot. I will say from the power plant side that they do need a lot of water, and we did have a lot of water issues back when I used to work in merchant power development. So going in and claiming a lot of surface water for cooling purposes was very problematic in some areas. I'm just going to leave that up to the experts in the individual states, but it is something to be mindful of, and that is a cost that needs to be considered. As an economist, I think the appropriate solution for all that is monetizing that appropriately and making sure people are paying for the resources that they're using for, and usually you can solve that problem.
Yeah, the water I was thinking it was actually going to the data center, cooling it down because it uses a bunch, but,
But
thank
you're
you. very-
probably going to have both ends of that, right? You're going to,
Right.
you're going to equipment side of that on the cooling side and the power requirement.
Thank you very much.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Mr. Schreiber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the presentation.
Sir.
My question is about siting. Um, You know, 40, 50 years ago, there were a lot of small plants in a lot of locations serving local load. Now, larger plants were built, large baseload plants build out the transmission grid to ship that power around. And renewables have been put out where people can't see them. But we're going to need, I think NERC had 83 gigawatts by 2030, and yours said 88 or something like that. But there's going to be a lot of power that's going to be needed. So siting, I think, is really going to be an issue, whether it's near a population center or out in the boonies where we have to build more transition. Could you kind of see where that might be going?
Yeah, I would just say, again, those are going to be unique to each of the states that are looking at these issues. It will become problematic. The water will get into the siting issues, as you mentioned earlier, and will be some public opposition issues to that. Looking for opportunities for low-hanging fruit on repowering existing facilities or facilities that have been retired that may still have transmission availability in those areas that were solid fuel or low-hanging fruit that people have talked about. Adding more, when I say repowering, is taking an existing facility and adding more capacity there and or swapping that capacity out is an option too. I think it'll be important consideration and need determinations at the commission and assuring, at least from a public confidence perspective, that the power plants are needed and that they will be serving a broad constituency in terms of where that power is, and communicating that is going to be important too. We've got big power requirements everywhere, not just alone in that. And so people need to be mindful of that. And again, getting back to the question about ratepayers and education, I think there's a big education component on this, on what's really moving. It's not just that alone. It's the Teslas that are being plugged into the households. It's the conversion of apartments to all electric homes instead of, combinations of gas and electric. All these kinds of things are contributing to it.
Ms. Bohai.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation. Going back to earlier in the presentation regarding your intermittent resources slide, which I believe is slide 6, and then also referring to slide 17 with capacity challenges. My question is, on the intermittent resources, as it implies, that's the wind, the solar, the renewable hybrid, but you have on there the natural gas. Do we not have any coal-powered plants feeding into the interconnection? Do we not,
No. Yeah, nobody's building any coal plants right now.
No, I know they're not building them, but we currently have them, they haven't been decommissioned. So,
Right.
so like the
Those-
nuclear plants are not going into the power pool and the coal plants are not going into the power pool?
Right. So those are only looking at the incremental requests for the new stuff that's asking to be put onto the grid, and it doesn't include the existing. So you're right, that's not in that number. It's only for the new stuff.
So this is for the future?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I misunderstood that.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, exactly.
Representative Berquist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, sir, for your testimony.
Sir.
Just from a fairly nonpartisan perspective or not, you're an expert in the industry, you've worked in the industry. What one thing or two things has to happen to keep a winter storm Uri from being a catastrophe of a larger proportion? What has to happen to transform the industry to be sustainable and to be reliable for that kind of situation?
Yeah, so that's a good question. A lot of that has to do with increased and better communication and coordination between electric infrastructure and natural gas infrastructure, as I mentioned before. I still to this day, don't think there's a good appreciation for how interrelated that is. And I think there needs to be more discussion, and I think that has occurred since that time period between the electric industry and the natural gas industry, so that there's not cross-pointing of fingers between, well, there's no gas available, well, I don't have electricity, so there can't be gas available. These are things that have popped up. This popped up, believe it or not, as recently as as late as 2005 when Katrina came through and we had gas coming off the Gulf of Mexico, and that's where we got it then, as opposed to the shale resources in the Permian Basin. So there is a lot of integration and I think communication that needs to be done in that particular area. And then I hate to say this, but just because I know this may not be real popular with the renewable energy crowd, but making sure that we have a healthy natural gas industry and we have relatively level and steady drilling in the country, and we continue to facilitate the use of that resource is important too. We've got trillions of cubic feet of resources available throughout the United States. I would tend to think that we still have scratched the surface in many of the unconventional plays and some that we haven't even gotten around to. I think there's some in Kansas that people even haven't really gotten around to going and figuring out. We've got some in Louisiana, believe it or not, that we haven't even gone to scratching around. Most of the attention has been in the Permian, to a lesser extent in the Bakken, and to a much lesser extent down in the Eagle Ford here in this part of the world, and then in the Marcellus Shale up in Pennsylvania. But making sure we continue to have that industry, assuring that we continue to make those investments in the infrastructure or maintain the investments that we've got right now. You may not think of LNG as being interconnected into these issues because they're exporting the gas somewhere else. But the thing about LNG is that when you build one of those plants there, it reinforces the need for the existing infrastructure that's around and keeps it from getting retired and pulled out of place. There's a lot of infrastructure in South Louisiana, for instance, that was built for the peak production days in the Gulf of Mexico when we were producing 25% of the natural gas. We only produce maybe 8% now or less. But in a lot of had that trend continued, a lot of that infrastructure might have gotten retired because of that. But instead of LNG, I've got to move now gas. The gas is moving in different directions rather than moving from the south up into the northeast or the mid-continent. It's moving backwards actually in another direction, but we still have it there. So that's the importance of maintaining healthy industry in all parts of that value chain, is because it keeps and reinforces that backbone that we've got. Because the best way that we should have learned during the Enron days is the best way to get spikes in energy prices is capacity constraints on the infrastructure, whether it be on the production side or the transmission or the distribution side. So those are the things: communication and maintaining that infrastructure.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Now on to my ranking member, Mr. Hobson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation today. I was just looking at your slide, and actually on slide 27, when you actually talk about your forecast, you talked about in 2022, it went from 19 gigawatts to in 2024, went to 88. Are we going to continue to see like very steep increases over the year? Is there a time where it's actually going to like level off?
Yeah.
And is there, your thoughts on that?
Great question. Yeah, I think there's some people that like to see a linear extrapolation, that line going up. It probably won't happen, right, for a lot of different reasons. Market will start to get saturated for one reason alone, and we'll get lots of data center development, and we just can't build data centers if there isn't the demand for that. So the demand is going to constrain that growth now. Right now, that demand is beyond that, but at some point, those two will sync up, and you'll see that flattening out alone. The second thing that we kind of alluded to and I talked about earlier is just going to be natural efficiency gains that I think will occur in that industry through technology or equipment or operating practices. Maybe, for instance, in cooling technologies that reduce the water and the energy you need to keep these systems cool, as an example. And it's going to lead to that too. So yeah, it's not going to be an infinitely growing curve. I think in the near term, when we've got this disconnect between supply and demand, we've got this opportunity for growth. It's there, but it will flatten out over time and other things. And one of the things I do caution people is I do think the window is going to be pretty tight on this too. I mean, within the next 5 years or so is probably going to be where the bulk of this is going to occur, and then it probably will flatten out. So a lot of people are talking about, well, we can do nuclear and we can build small modular reactors. Well, that's great. You might can use that as the next generation to replace the energy requirements for those facilities, but you're not going to use those to meet today's requirements that are coming in. It just won't take, we can't get there fast enough. And that's the thing today, is the speed of getting this up and going and moving today. And that's when I hear from the industry side of this, their biggest constraint is they need things to move at the speed of business.
That's another one. Okay. Thank you for that. I just wanted to follow up with the question that Representative Schreiber asked with respect to siting. I know that data centers, just like you indicated, use a lot of electricity. Now, for areas that are considering putting data centers, are there any, because of the amount of electricity that's going to be used and that's going to be coming in, are there any health hazards that should the city or county needs to be aware of in terms of their siting as to where they need to put these data centers, so that they won't be around all this electricity coming into the center that's going to be needed? Is there any health hazards that we should be aware of, or anything that could potentially happen?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any at this point in time, and all of these facilities will have to meet local siting ordinances and requirements, as well as the standards of interconnecting into the grid that will be done either by a host utility in large part, if you're vertically integrated in that state, or a merchant power developer that will have to follow those local and federal guidelines as well. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mr. Roth?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for just a tremendous presentation. It's way cool in my opinion. So, and I was thinking about paradigms, and currently our paradigm is wind and solar, and that's referenced as intermittent power. Also, natural gas has been around for a long time. Coal-fired plants. I've got a friend that's out in Colorado, and I guess the coal-fired plant is 99.96% pure emission into the air, so only like 0.04, so it's really basically clean energy as well. But those are the things that we think about for energy. Have you seen, or do you foresee, or have you heard of anything that would be outside of our current paradigm of energy, of anything new energy or any new energy source coming in the near future or down the lane? Or is it only going to be wind, solar, natural gas, and
I think to meet this current period of challenges we have, it's probably going to be what we got, right? I think there's been discussions about many other things that are out there, and they all have unique opportunities. I'm not familiar with each and every one of them. Hydrogen has been an issue that's been discussed a lot. I've done a lot of work in that area, but I would say that one probably has the near-term commercial opportunities, but even in that area, it's a very tough nut to crack, and I could go on for an hour about that. There's just it requires a lot of energy to make that energy first and foremost, and it needs a lot of help financially to make it economic and viable. And so if there's not some kind of subsidy that's out there, it's probably not going to get there. And so when you ask me that question about those other resources, without some probably additional financial help and support, they won't be able to serve this new near-term challenge that we're being faced with. So I do think the good answer in all of this is that we do have the resources and the opportunity to meet it. There's not, unlike years past and decades past, where we were concerned about where the energy resource was going to come from, or where we're going to import it, or did we even have enough. We do have enough, but it's probably going to be stuck in the things that we know: wind, solar, and natural gas. And look, I continue, this is not a choice between natural gas and renewable energy. And again, it's not intended to throw shade on renewable energy. If you look at those names of those companies that are up there that are looking at developing these data centers, they have a natural incentive to want to enhance their renewable energy attributes of their facilities and the green and cleanness of their facilities as well, for a variety of different reasons. In my experience with most of them, is they come in hand with renewable backing for their project, whether they're contract for differences in developments in other parts of the country, et cetera. So I don't see this as diminishing in any way renewable energy, but when it comes down, we can't do this by contract anymore. We can't do this by paper anymore. We actually need physical electrons. We need physical energy. And so the one thing that's really going to bring that this time around is probably going to be on the thermal side, the natural gas, and then I'll contract for differences out for the renewable attributes that I need. So it may not be clean at this particular site, but I'm going to invest somewhere else over there to offset that difference. And in total, we've gotten a net.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You bet. Any further questions? Not seeing any. I've got a few. Did you have one? Okay, I've got a few here if I could, and some of them may be a little bit of repeats, but we've got, we've got Evergy in the room. We've got Kansas Electric Co-ops represented here too. But in the case of Evergy, we're currently in the process of putting up a couple of new gas plants throughout the state. Currently got wind, coal, solar, and a big Wolf Creek nuclear plant going. But if I was to say, sir, you've got unlimited funds from us, what would you recommend the percentages of the generation mix? How much should be renewable? How much should be gas? How much should be?
Oh boy, that's a loaded question, huh? You want me to get home today? Look, I think in the near term, these investments and what y'all have done relative to changing the statutes and making the improvements on natural gas generation availabilities are important. A lot of other states have been looking at that, by the way. I do work in Oklahoma, and they've been looking at y'all's legislation. I think it's been positively viewed by a number of other places. I would just say in the near term, I think the pendulum does need to be moving more towards some more thermal resources, and that's the thing in the near term we need to be thinking about. I don't know what that exact percent is going to be, I think the market will determine, and it's best to let the market determine that instead of kind of getting ahead of that. And I think that where we do get into trouble in the United States in setting policy is when we try to get ahead of the market and try to say this is the appropriate percentage, and we're wrong about that. So letting the market and letting the utilities figure that out based on the interactions that they have with data centers and other large users, communicating to them what their needs are, and then making sure that they sell that need to the commission is important.
As you know, we're part of the SPP, and they keep talking about the great westward expansion. What are some pitfalls of letting them expand to the west with us, or maybe advantages? Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, there's always the theoretic concept of having bigger, broader markets and a greater availability. The more competitive your markets are, the greater your supply, your opportunities to supply and demand, the better you can get an equilibrium in those prices. So this goes back to the early days of creating RTOs themselves, and greater geographic scope and greater markets create efficiencies in and of themselves. So that is on the positive side, and creating incentives and offsetting opportunities between, particularly with renewable energy resources, where you may have solar in one area and wind. When we in Louisiana first started getting it, when we joined MISO, for instance, and we're expanding northward, so to speak, as opposed to just being by ourselves, we had no RTO at the time. The idea was we could offset coal with natural gas. So when their coal's cheap, we could use it and bring it down south, and when our gas was cheap, we could send it up there. Today, it's been different. It's been more their wind up there and our solar down in the south. Those kinds of opportunities when you expand markets are what create those efficiencies. The downside is going to be cost. You got this integration cost, investment cost, and infrastructure cost. And we've eaten a lot of costs over the last couple of decades, and I think we need to be mindful of that.
So down in your home state or other place you've been, have thoughts on, or have you experienced power purchase agreements? And I'm thinking mainly in conjunction with large projects. We've got Panasonic up here. Spirit Airlines are now becoming Boeing, but maybe to where they could say, hey, I need a small modular reactor to run my operations. Do you see that in the future?
Yes, I do, and that has been a little bit of a contentious area, admittedly, particularly with regulated utilities, but I think it is something that ought to be considered and examined. If I'm a large user and I can go and procure for cheaper, can I offset those energy requirements? Let me deal with it and develop it. Let me assume the risk, whether it's a renewable energy attribute or it's just standard thermal one. We are looking at some of those things. I don't know the exact status of that right now in South Louisiana. As you know, we do have really large single users that are as big as the utility themselves. They have power plants that are 500 megawatts at the Dow Chemical facility or at the Exxon refinery that rival what the utilities have. So they are looking at those kinds of things. Interestingly enough, part of the discussion of that started with renewable energy. Many of these big corporations like Exxon and BP and Shell have their own renewable energy arms and can develop renewable energy just as effectively as a utility can, if not, they would argue maybe even better. So why couldn't they do it themselves and get around kind of the requirements? So yes, that's a long answer to the short question, which is yeah.
Shorter question, does hydrogen have a future?
I think so, but it's going to be a niche one. You know, we're again, and I think it's going to be, I hate to keep bringing it down to where I live, but I think in the Gulf Coast where you've got really large thermal requirements and you can substitute that for boilers, where you've got a lot of furnace and thermal requirements for boilers and for furnaces, for heat, for distillation units, and for those big super industrial processes. And for power, and for some power plant generation in those areas. I mean, our ability for solar and wind is limited in Louisiana, right? But we could do hydrogen. And so those are the things that we're looking at. But it's going to be really unique niche type stuff. I don't think it's going to be taking over the world.
And final question, I promise. This one has just been wrestling around with me for some time, but do we need a defined state energy plan? And I've heard some say yes, some say no. What's your thoughts on that?
I tend to be more in the no camp of that. I like to let markets, and especially nowadays, markets are changing so rapidly and so quickly that I think letting the market tell us and making sure that as policymakers we're in a good position to react, and that is probably the better idea. You know, maybe 2-3 decades ago that might have been the answer. That might have been different, but I think today it's just better sitting back. You don't want to have a lot of white elephants and run a lot of expenses at the cost of ratepayers.
Okay. Well, any further questions while he's here? I sure appreciate you making the appearance. I think you're over on the Senate this afternoon.
Yes, sir, I am.
So welcome again to Kansas, and appreciate you being here.
All right, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
You bet. So, yeah, good one. let's see, this is our last committee meeting for the year. So if you've got packets in there, please take them with you. Just wanted to let you know our big bill this year, 2149, that we all worked on. Last Thursday, you know, it passed the House 123-0. So I was extremely pleased with that. Went over and testified to the Senate yesterday on it, and the Senate committee kicked it out unanimously as well. There was there was a couple technical amendments that one of the senators put on. It was just on font size and that kind of stuff, changed nothing of the character or the content of the bill. So very pleased with how that's going. There looks like there may be a few bills heading to conference in the next week or two, and I'll just keep you apprised on those. Nothing urgent at this point in time. And overall, it was a good year, and I wanted to let you know if anybody has suggestions for bills and so forth for 2026, please get with me and see what we can do. And if we need to do a interim committee over the summer to maybe dive into some stuff, I'm open to it. We can make that happen. Other than that, I hope. Okay. I'll hold the last two comments, Mr. Berquist.
I just want to say thank you to the industries and to the chair for your work this year.
Wasn't all me. I couldn't have done it without you. So and that goes for the people sitting out there. You guys had a big role in that, in a couple of the bills here, and I really appreciate it. So, Mr. O'Hobbitson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just wanted to say that, of course, since our last meeting, wanted to say, you know, it was great working with you this particular session, also with our vice chair. We've accomplished a lot. And from our side of the aisle, thank you for being open to us and allowing us for our ideas and all of that. So I want to thank our revisers, the staff as well. So thank you for all the work you guys have done, and also all the major players in the room. So thank you for everything that you guys have done from our side of the aisle. So thank you, sir.
I appreciate that. I'm just curious if I accomplished anything with my vice chair. My goal this year was to at least get him a house broke, and not sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, both for the opportunity to speak and the fact that I'm still being trained. And yeah, so thank you for your help.
So other than that, any questions, comments, concerns? We are adjourned. Thank you.